Things are really unpredictable. For example, might not be able to tell, but there's a haze from fires in the interior, and it just arrived this morning because it wasn't like this yesterday. So you can see it better there because the sun is kind of blurred out. And the reason I mention this is because it was rainy for a couple days, or cloudy without the smoke, and I was thinking, well, after the rain goes away, I'll be able to sit in the sun and get a tan. Well, can't really do that now because there's smoke, and there probably will be for some period of time. I think last year it was like that for quite a while. Spider eating a bug. So as much as we'd like things to be predictable, they're just not that way. All of a sudden the smoke from the interior makes its way down here, and the sun vibration is largely inaccessible. And I got a little bag of high chews. I bought a Costco bag a couple weeks ago and I ate it pretty quick, so I got a small bag because they were at the drugstore where I dropped off my prescription for Nazanan, and they said it's discontinued, or they can only get the 5 milligrams, not the 2, which is what I was prescribed. So they're gonna have to do some dangling to get the 5s, and then get the doctor to change it to 2.5 milligram prescription so I can take half. And my doctor also upped the dosage of trazodone to up to 150 a night. I've been taking 100. I could try 150 and skip the Zopiclone, but I've been sleeping so well and I don't really want to mess with it right now. So I'm going to keep up that same regime of 2.5 quetiapine, 100 milligrams trazodone, and half Zopiclone, and I went down to 1 Benadryl. I might try to get rid of the Benadryl. And yeah, so high chews. I remember reading an article on drmercola.com saying it's good to have less than 67 grams of sugar a day. Well, there's 25 grams in 8 pieces of these, so I don't really think I'm following that right now, but I also know that light is more fundamental than matter, and matter comes from light. So when one has access to the light, it doesn't really matter as much. And yeah, I have a lot to talk about. I think I switched into positivity or creativity, writing more a couple of days ago. I felt the switch, and it's interesting because today so far I was sitting in Tim Hortons for like 3 or 4 hours having coffee and watching my Deep Abundance Dive replay, and I didn't have any tense breathing yet. So it'll be interesting because I don't think I've had the spire in when the switches happened. I haven't been wearing it as much lately. I should have wore it yesterday. I had a long conversation with somebody, but I didn't wear it, and wearing it today. So yeah, I'll show that screenshot of spire too. It'll be interesting if I have barely any tense breathing now that I've made the switch. The switch has happened even though I'm taking quite a bit of medication to sleep. So the meds don't really do that much, and I have thoughts on that too. So I've noticed that my brain is speeding up, or I'm starting to have insights again. And this makes sense because I think it's about August 12th or something. And I think I really started struggling again in mid-May. So the struggle for me usually lasts about 3 months. And so mid-May to mid-June, July, August, mid-August. So the 3 months is sort of up. So it's time for my brain to speed up. This is just the rhythm. And I came across a study talking about how cognitive deficits happen more in bipolar people that are euthymic, meaning stable. And I think it means stable, I don't know for sure. But I was thinking about the word euthymic, and it has the same ending as rhythmic. So euthymic probably would be without any rhythm. And I think bipolar is a type of rhythm that is different in a way. So I have a rhythm of 3 months slowed down and then 5 months of sped up. And I was thinking about that, and I've been making some notes. So here, I made something about euthymic to rhythmic. And so I wrote something about restoring the rhythm. When I write me in my notes, that's usually because it's something that came into my mind and it's not somebody else's. Sometimes, yeah, I'll make a note on what somebody says, but I like to make the distinction when I authored something seemingly myself. So I wrote down that bipolar is a rhythm designed to destroy the old and create the new. And what I saw when I was saying that is that the supposed good mood, in quotes, is a creative movement, and whatever we create is often new, and a lot of the world is based on repetition. So what we create is something often really new, and that's why we build a lot of energy from that, creating something new. And so that's correlated with the so-called good mood. And then the other movement is, the so-called bad mood. But a lot of times, or sometimes at least, there's some energy in the bad mood, in like anger or something. That's a really strong energy. And I think that energy is partly designed to destroy the old. So in a way, creating something new and destroying something old, those two distinct things are part of the same kind of movement, because destroying the old would imply making room for something new. So I talked about this sort of thing before in different ways, but this way I'm talking about it is a bit different in that the good mood creates something new, and the so-called bad mood is destroying the old. Destroying it in the sense of, if somebody with bipolar has a lot of anger to the point where they can't hide it like other people do, then it's sort of augmenting that, and people really see it. And somebody who has bipolar diagnosis who has a lot of anger could destroy their family or destroy their relationships with their family. And I think that's part of what is happening and is possibly kind of meant to happen. And I'm not trying to say this in like being against families or anything, but our family system and our family history is part of our attachment. It's how we were conditioned growing up. And a lot of times when we go into so-called mania or creativity or inspired genius, the energy we put into thoughts about our family structure is temporarily gone, and in that way we can be super creative. And then when that wave ends, then we start to lose energy, and we sort of go kicking and screaming back into the family structure. Often, unless we're kicked out of our family structure, we're like, oh yeah, we'll behave, we'll take our medicines, we'll be in the family structure, just keep us safe, and I want to survive. And then we end up having something like probably like bipolar basement syndrome, living in our parents' basement for the rest of our lives. And being so-called euthymic, I don't know if euthymic means stable or if it means depressed, but the study that I read, it says cognitive, well, I don't know if I'll go into that now. I might. There's lots to go into, and I want to talk about more stuff because I'm seeing what I've talked about in new and different ways, and I think that's part of the point, is to keep learning. So the other day I picked up a copy of one of the Bipolar Hope magazines, BP Hope, and I was just flipping through it, and this little square box with a blurb in it caught my attention. And what it said was, cognitive impairment common in stable mood. November 15th, 2016, Glasgow, Scotland. Cognitive impairment is widespread among people with bipolar disorder who are currently in a stable mood state, a new study suggests. Scottish researchers analyzed the results of 15 previous studies that included statistics on the prevalence of cognitive impairment. They found up to 57.7% of study participants showed noticeable deficits in executive function, quote, or bracket, the ability to plan and organize, bracket, and attention/working memory. Up to 44.2% had deficits in reaction time, verbal memory, and visual memory. Greater cognitive impairment was associated with a more severe or long-standing illness and antipsychotic medication. Study, Journal of Affective Disorders, and the study name is Prevalence and Correlates of Cognitive Impairment in Euthymic Adults with Bipolar Disorder, a systematic review. So I'd like to put this in another way. Bipolar disorder is said to be incurable. So at some point, if someone lives long enough, they will have a long-standing illness. And it said greater cognitive impairment was associated with more severe or long-standing illness. So the longer we live, the sooner it becomes a long-standing illness in any individual case. And more severe, well, whatever that means exactly, and it also says it's also associated with antipsychotic medications. Well, people who are generally on antipsychotics for bipolar, not always, but if they happen to be, then it sounds like that's part of what causes or is correlated, it says, to greater cognitive impairment. So cognitive impairment being the things that it said: executive function decline, the ability to plan and organize, attention, working memory, and then 44.2% reaction time, verbal memory and visual memory deficits. And so, point being, at some point, if somebody's diagnosed, their illness will be long-standing if they live long enough. If they don't become part of the 20% that ends up ending their life. And so it's saying here, and I would say that probably the longer standing the illness is, the more likelihood somebody is going to end up on antipsychotics, because those are tranquilizers. So I would put more weight into the deficits associated with antipsychotics, maybe higher dose antipsychotics. I'm not sure, because I've never been on high dose antipsychotics for a long period of time. I'm talking, the whole 800 milligrams of Seroquel XR, something like that. Right now I'm taking 125 milligrams of quetiapine at night. And that's Seroquel as well, but it's the fast release, and it's to help me sleep more than anything. So I don't think it interferes as much with my daily functioning. My brain twin said, "Oh, you're not on any antipsychotics during the day?" I said, "No, I take a bunch of stuff to sleep, and during the day, well, during the day I take vitamins, and I think that helps." So the other thing that I think that this is implicitly saying, if you look at this from the perspective of someone with the condition, supposedly, that maybe having a stable mood state isn't a goal, because it's saying if you have a stable mood state, you have a 60% chance of deficits in executive function and attention and working memory, and 44% chance of deficit in reaction time, verbal memory, and visual memory. Well, that's not cool. So they're trying to make us stable, but by doing so, we apparently have these cognitive impairments. And I think for me, and the context that I've built for myself, and I've been building for myself, if I hadn't built that context so long, I might look at this and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared. But I look at it and I'm not afraid, because I've learned so much about myself and understood so much about myself. So I would say, hey, I'm not aiming for a stable mood. And if I don't aim for a stable mood, then maybe I get to keep my executive functioning. You know, maybe if somebody, instead of trying to be in a stable mood and then having a 60% chance of less executive functioning, noticeable deficits, maybe I'd rather be 60% mania and have high executive functioning, and 40% depression and have next to none. So 60% of the time I have good executive functioning. So then I might say, well, if I can minimize the damage of the low executive functioning time, or live in such a way that I can function minimally, and then not be afraid of the time of high executive functioning, or so-called mania, which Steve Pavlina emailed me back, and he said something about how mania, when shared, is inspiration and genius and creativity, or something like that. And I was like, that's kind of true. And so also, with what I'm looking at in this little blurb of a study, and this is why it's hard for me to read other people's information sometimes, because one little blurb about a study, not even the study itself, will lead me to see a lot more into it than just what the words are saying. And so, you know, statistics on cognitive impairment. So they're saying that in a stable mood, you know, people will have, 60% of people will have noticeable deficits in executive functioning, which in brackets they say the ability to plan and organize. Okay, well, that could be important, maybe. And attention and working memory. So the ability to plan and organize. Plan what? Organize what? I think part of what happens with this bipolar thing is that cognition purposefully shuts down, because our cognition, not only because, but our cognition is conditioned. All this stuff, all our thinking stuff in the prefrontal cortex, which is largely responsible for human cognition, is conditioned. It's not natural. It's, you know, the whole thought structure of I need to be better, I need this, I should that, I blah blah blah, and that whole thing shuts down, and then we're not able to plan and organize to be better and to make money at other people's expense, or whatever the hell it is. And attention, well, what have we been conditioned to pay attention to? The economy, you know, monotony, making money being a function of the cog in the machine. Like, the brain, the areas that would make us a cog in the machinery of the world, shut down. And then we're said to be ill. Well, it's shutting down because we just don't want to participate with that anymore. And there are other ways we could participate, there are other things that we might pay attention to. You know, even our working memory is based on all our thoughts and memories that we've been conditioned with, working in a certain way to be the working memory. And it's all conditioned. It's not necessarily real. And to some extent, through bipolar, the cycle of it, we've seen what that all does. And I've explained the mechanisms that work to break that down too. And so, you know, also deficits in verbal memory and visual memory. Why is our visual system tied so much into memory? It needs to be to some extent, for sure. But I think our visual system and our verbal system is changing in bipolar, in that we can look at the present moment and have words created out of that, creative words versus words from conditioned memory. So the brain is changing in its algorithm. We might think that certain areas of the brain are designated for cognition, but in bipolar disorder, I feel like the brain gets in touch with something else and some other algorithm. They say we use, 5% of our brain, and sometimes they say no, we use more and everything like that. So instead of trying to get that 5% back, or whatever it is that is human cognition, and you could think of, 5% of the brain being used for human cognition or whatever it is, that's because our brain has been limited. We can only process a very little part of reality with the conditioning we've been given, and there's a lot more to see. And when we get in touch with those other structures of the brain, or gain energy, which is the energy not being wasted in the thought systems and the cognition of the human brain, then we have access to being able to see more that we can't see. But it's right here in front of us too. It's sort of like the salience. What is made salient in the infinite energy of any given moment changes by the changes in the brain. And also, since our brains are quite powerful, that's another reason why the cognition shuts down, because the power of that would sort of just short circuit the human cognition because it's so small. So if we are using 5% of the circuits in our brain for this little human cognition vibration we've been given through our conditioning, when that total infinitely more powerful energy comes in and tries just to go through human cognition, it blows it out because it's such a little energy fragment of what is possible or potential. So so what I realized today, partly, but I've said this before probably in a different way at some point, is that I think the fact that human executive functioning declining isn't a problem. If we think about how that executive functioning is part of the 5% of the brain, what we need to do is figure out how to function based on the 95% that has been edited out and ignored because of human conditioning. You might not even call it human cognition, it's just human conditioning. It's not our actual separate thinking, it's just part of this big machinery of human cognition that we've been given. And so I think when that shuts down, what can happen is it shuts down and we have lower executive functioning, probably when we're in a depressed mood, quote. And then when the energy comes back and we seem to be in a good mood, what happens is that energy goes in again and energizes human cognition. And since human cognition can't take that energy, it eventually destabilizes and sort of implodes. And then we're left again being, 60% chance of, or 60% chance of lower executive functioning. Well, I don't think our function is to function the way humans are functioning with their executive functioning. The illusion of separation is kept going with that structure. And that's not truly how it is at all. So I think what happens partly is that you could call human cognition the 5% or what have you. Well, when that starts to not be energized, human cognition is objectivity, seeing things as object and separate, seeing things as objects separate from each other. And then when this other brain algorithm comes online, what happens is I feel that we go more into subjectivity, and the laws of physics become more fluid, and the brain becomes more fluid, and as such, the reality we experience becomes more fluid. And this is easier to get away with among strangers, but when we're among those who were conditioned with the same brain structures as us, like our family or something, it's harder to get away with that for a long period of time. So one might think of human cognition as the center of human conditioning, conditioning objectivity. And something I realized when I was writing today, when that homeless man years ago, he told me to create the dream center, I realized in a way that I have been creating the dream center, but it's actually a center within consciousness, or it's a different center in the brain, or structure in the brain, or scaffolding or algorithm of the brain. It's not necessarily a physical place yet. It might be a physical place at some time, but right now it's one could say that the 95% functioning of the brain is the dream center, and this material world becomes more like a dream world. And this correlates or extrapolates with what I was talking about, and how, there's regular material consciousness, and then when one starts to wake up, that's when one sees everything being interconnected, and that's more like a space of dreaming where everything in a dream is interconnected. It's made of the same dream stuff. So we see everything is made of the same dream stuff. And so taking medications to fall asleep becomes a bit more necessary, it seems, when one is surrounded by the material structure of thought and human conditioning, but beginning to wake up and see life more as this dream. And so when one is double awake, it's doubly hard to fall asleep, especially when time is different in that space. And the energy is higher, so it could be true that we don't need as much sleep when we're all awake together. So yeah, I have a bit of a headache, and I think it could be the smoke in the air, or also I haven't really talked to myself this way in quite a long time, just very small snippets, and I'm finding it a little bit tiring, like this takes some stamina or something. But I'm glad I talked about that quote from that study. But my point being, I think one of the main important things to see is that the executive functioning that we take as so important as the way humans operate now, there are many other brain circuits lying dormant that we can activate that would give us a different type of executive functioning. We would have, and I think that's something that I'm learning now, by just sort of wandering and not really planning anything, and So yeah, I think the executive functioning is part of the sensation of being a separate doer, of which there's no such thing. So we can learn to use a different part of the brain than that little 5% that has been energized to be this thinker that thinks it is a separate doer. You know, we see this in bipolar or maybe mania or psychosis at some point. I don't know if everyone experiences psychosis, but if anyone's ever experienced the whole like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this, or being under the control of thought, it's really highlighting or augmenting so that we can see that we're being controlled by thought. And then we go back and we think, well, I have to control my thoughts. But that, I feel, is a misinterpretation. There's no me, there's no my that thinks. There is this process of thinking that is controlling us like puppets. So instead of trying to control thoughts, one would see how one is being controlled by thought, and thus negating it altogether, not saying, well, I'm going to think this better thought to be controlled by. So, for example, when I was on the island and I had that poison feel like it went throughout my system and wanted to it made me so afraid. I freeze. I don't do anything. Because if I do something, then it has again then infected my nervous system and musculature as the doer. Thought has then moved me as a doer. But if I stay still, it hasn't created any of those circuits to go within the muscles, because, you know, there's a thought, like say somebody has a violent thought. That's just a vibration in the brain. But then one has to have those circuits of that behavior within the nervous system and the muscles in the body in order to enact it. So say somebody's paralyzed and they have a violent thought. They can't get up and do it, for example. Sad example, but true. But if somebody has the capability in order to do that, then they might. But if we freeze and we don't do anything, then we've just sort of broken the circuit. This thought vibration tries to come in and move our whole body. Well, we've disconnected between the thought vibration and the movement of our whole body, and therefore it can no longer move us. So say I have an overcoming, a feeling of terror that overcomes me, and I just lay there and wait it out. I end up not calling 911 because I'm terrified. I don't have to go to the hospital. I don't enact that whole machinery around me to help me in some way. I can actually help myself by not doing anything. And then that loosens not only the sense of doership within oneself, thought tied to the doer of marionetting the musculature through the conditioned nervous system, but all the doership of psychiatry that would then come to us as a result. So say I have a negative thought of something violent, and so I call 911 for help. And I'm in this terrified state now. The ambulance comes, they take me in, I go to the psych ward, you know, they throw me in a room, they put me there for weeks, they medicate me, they have all these nurses and doctors around. Think of all the energy of all those gestures of all those people, the ambulance driver, the person who built the ambulance, the person who created an ambulance back hundreds of years ago, you know, before it was a horse and buggy. All this machinery, you know, all the people trained as nurses, all the years they went to university. You know, this one violent thought in my head, or multiple violent thoughts, for maybe a few minutes, maybe not in the beginning, but eventually one can get it down to a very small portion of time, and then it goes away, and then there's no need to call for help. You know, that's one thought, and this little bit of time of violence, and I call for help. All these people come running to my rescue, and it's a big machine to gobble me up again into a system of thought, and other doers doing something to me because I thought I might do something according to thought that I apparently can't control, in quotes. No, there's no I that can control it. We're all under the control of thought. And so when we break those circuits, You know, it wants to move me. It's putting all its energy into moving me to call for help or do something violent or to myself or others, and I just freeze. It's like those chains just breaking. And then it can't have any control anymore. And the trouble is, though, if somebody gets back thinking, well, there's good thoughts and there's bad thoughts, and I want the good thoughts and the pleasurable thoughts, but not the bad, violent ones, well, it's all the same. That's why the pleasure of mania turns into the pain of psychosis or suicide feelings. Yeah. So I'm not saying don't call for help. I'm just saying that we can get to a place where we don't need that kind of help. And imagine if when we first were diagnosed bipolar, that a friendly nurse or person with lived experience came up to us and said, don't worry, this will get easier. You'll begin to function in new ways. You're going to be able to harvest and harness your gifts, and you're not going to be as scared of it. You're going to be able to overcome fear entirely because of this, because it gets so augmented in you, and because you're able to absorb it into emptiness and transmute it. You are going to be really strong, and it's going to become less and less scary over time. But instead we're told this is a lifelong condition. You'll have it forever. You're going to have multiple med changes. Your executive functioning is going to tank. You are going to get worse and worse over time. You'll probably need more and more medication over time. Blah, blah, blah. The more relapses you have, the worse it gets. So a relapse would be like an up and a down, right? And they're saying stay stable. Yet in this blurb that I just read, they're saying staying stable will make it so we don't have any executive functioning. Or a lot of people have less of it. And I say screw that executive functioning. We don't need it. We have the other 95% of our brain that we can access. And the trouble is that 5% accessing it is actually what's wasting the other 95% of the energy, because 5% of the energy in the cognitive structures of humanity is all based on fear. We're trying to be afraid of everything through the news, the media, economy. Buy this to feel better. If we weren't afraid, we wouldn't buy stuff. And so when that 5% goes away, it's like emptying the cup of all the waste, and we can wait and allow the 95% to come in, which is the energy of love, which is way more powerful and meaningful, creative, inspiring, and it could give us access to genius. So that's something that I wasn't really planning to practice these last few months, which is not doing much of anything. I've never really done that for an extended period of time. And it's partly because of just the way things have happened. And now I feel like, since I've spent so much time accidentally on purpose not engaging that 5%, that piddly little bit of executive functioning that they try so hard for us to get back so we can be a cog in the machine of the economy. What they do, since we've lost that 5% executive functioning, what they fill that 5% with is all the memes of illness, of how now we're less than, how we don't have any value. Well, we don't have any executive functioning, we don't have any value. So they fill our brain with that. The whole psychological comparison and measurement, when we're each distinct and unique and part of the greater whole, part of the greater puzzle, part of the big dream, instead of part of the little machinery. So that was another thing that I realized today, in a way, is that when we go into that energy where we have access to new information and new memes, like pieces of it, we have this whole meme sphere of the human thought conditioning. And when our brain goes into that other state, we're able to have access to new memes and new information. But since they're not part of the whole collective structure of machinery, which is, it's nowhere but embedded in our brains and bodies of all those people who are working within that. When we pop out of that and get new information, it's like light. It's not yet embedded in the material of the brain and body. Most people aren't operating based on those memes, but we're able to see memes outside of the way that we're operating that might help to upgrade our operating system. So since people like me, bipolar people, might have seen some of them, but we're here, and everywhere in the world, and we haven't been talking together about what we've seen and had insight into or inspiration to see, visions, we're not able to make those vibrations of new information into you know, thought stuff that would then help to change the way we gesture and act, and the ways that we act and behave in mania. The traits that we have are, you know, we're able to pass them along a little bit, but we haven't been able to fully pass them along through the mirror neurons and the mimicry of humans. And part of what might allow some of that to start happening is by having dialogue about these things. So among bipolar people, we have this understanding, and then we're able to communicate with other people than just our neurotribe about what is happening here. That we have a different function. We're able to see something beyond these thought structures that we all share, and then when we pop out of it, when we come back into it, we're kind of scared into thinking that we're some kind of crazy. So if we've gone into a space where our brain is working based on a different algorithm than the algorithm we're programmed with, which is human cognition and executive functioning as we now know it, I think we're seeing something that scientists themselves haven't even seen. So it's up to us to create a language and a way to communicate this so it can be seen. Sometimes if you just say a word like strawberry, then the person you say it to, the next day they're walking down the street and they see a strawberry that they might have otherwise overlooked. So the word makes it salient. You know, so us being conditioned with so much fear makes fear salient, but there's a lot more. Like the video I took of the sunroof with the water on top because it had rained a little bit, and the clouds and the blue sky, like that just looks so beautiful to me. And being able to see that beauty in anything, in something simple, is kind of a sign that the brain has taken on the beauty algorithm. You know, I'm not thinking about war, I'm awestruck by something so simple. And I came across a quote that I wrote down by Ron Unger that said, "Psychiatry will be a force used to suppress spiritual or cultural innovation." And I think it is being used to suppress the innovation in perception and the algorithm or the functioning of the brain. So, you know, executive functioning as we know it now is a certain algorithm. But I feel, based on our experiences of going into altered states of consciousness, we need to delineate and make distinct and manifest what traits are coming into being in those states, and through that be able to put energy into creating those traits so that now we have a different way of moving and functioning in the world altogether. And I've talked about that before, like embody one's mania. But the more that I see about this crap about loss of executive functioning, the more I the more I just think it's a bunch of crap. So think about all the different traits and gestures that we have access to in so-called mania. Well, I don't think any of that has anything to do with human executive functioning. And the trouble with it is partly that it doesn't have anything to do with human executive functioning. We're not planning and organizing, we're acting spontaneously. And so what I've learned a little bit from Steve Pavlina, his deep dive into abundance course that I'm taking, is that we need to sort of remember the objectivity framework when we go into subjectivity. So an example of that could be myself, where now, I'm just seeing this now, that when I go into so-called mania, I don't do the actions of human hedonism, because the energy doesn't go into human thought structures that would say, that are based on economy, like buy more stuff, or gamble more money, or you know, sleep with more people. You know, it's just augmenting what humans already do. But what I do with it is I end up creating all these memes that I want to share in some way, which could be like a book. So instead of that energy going into running around wildly, which would just end up getting me in trouble, it goes into seeing different memes. So I'm seeing the memes, but I'm not necessarily acting on them. I'm writing them down. And if I were to act on them, I'm actually learning how to use was and were. I'm finding it's usually supposed to be were, and I usually say was. But I'm actually finding how to use that based on watching Downton Abbey with the subtitles on. They often say were, not was, and I really don't know how to use that properly. And I was realizing that it's possibly partly due to the fact that the way my brain seems to be wanting to evolve is not really talking about what was or what were, like what could have been happening or what was happening, which is all the past. The brain goes more based on present tense, and there could be something like a creative tense, which is something that is about seeing something that has never been seen, or bringing a meme into existence, not based on repetition or recombining old memes. Yeah, but so I don't know what I was talking about, but mania shared, I think I was trying to get to this, what I wrote down. Mania shared is inspiration, creativity, genius, and I added meaning. Steve was saying inspiration, creativity, and genius, which I've already talked about with myself before. But what I was thinking about is mania kept to oneself is hedonism usually. But when it's shared, like if one, instead of putting the energy into this ball of hedonism, if one channels the energy into grabbing memes, which can then be shared, these memes that are shared could end up animating everyone a little bit differently, instead of going into that space and animating oneself entirely differently to the point where everyone notices, and then we get in shit. So I'm seeing now that this relates to what I was saying about not acting based on the energy of being terrified or scared. So that energy comes in, might make me feel like I'm going to do something violent. I call for help, and then I have all these people coming at me. The whole reality conspires to swallow me up by psychiatry, which I don't think is wrong per se. I think it can be stopped if we stop ourselves from acting. And in the same way, when the energy comes in of mania, we can go based on and act all in these hedonic, crazy ways, or we can be composed and compose something, write something down, write out all these memes of meaning that if other people start to read it, might activate those brain cells from which, the same vibe of the brain from which those memes were able to be harvested from nothingness. And then people see in a bit of a different way. So yeah, I'm just seeing that there could be a reason to write versus act based on it. Because if we act based on it, people start looking at us sideways, and then they capture us. Well, we capture ourselves, I think. Because what happens when we act that way, and other people are acting based on thought, if we're acting based on that creative energy of mania, we're acting ourselves into a different world where not as many people are there acting in that way, mirroring that way. So then eventually it sort of gets pulled down to the consensus level. You know, thought is kind of like a union. It makes everyone unionized in mediocrity, and when people are free from that, they're free from that mediocrity, and you know, people probably kind of get jealous. But the thing is, we can share it with other people, and the great thing about it is that what I'm learning with myself lately is that it can't be used in a self-serving way. The self-serving way is augmenting the thinking structure, the current executive functioning that's based on I'm a separate me and I'm going to get what I want from myself. There is no me, there is no self, there is no separation. So doing anything about that is creating an illusion, and an illusion can only break, especially when the energy of the universe comes in to break the illusion. And one of the ways it breaks it and makes it so obvious is by making it balloon, so we can really see it, because otherwise it's operating invisible to us. So in the words of Thomas Metzinger, that energy comes in and it makes that self-structure opaque. It makes it visible. It's no longer clear. All of a sudden we see the spider web that we're trapped in.